Hello and good afternoon. My name is Rem Korteweg. I am a senior research fellow at the Clingendael Institute, and I'd like to give a warm welcome to all of you joining us either through Zoom or are watching this on YouTube for this fireside chat on Brexit that we are organizing in cooperation with the Irish Embassy in The Hague. Now, in normal times, Fintan, Caroline, and I would be seated in comfortable chairs talking to you, but today I hope many of you can join us from the comfort of your office from home, your drawing room, or your living room. In any case, thank you once again for joining us for this hour-long chat on where we are in the Brexit negotiations and what it means for the future of Europe. Now, at this juncture in the Brexit negotiations, we wanted to explore Dutch, Irish, and European perspectives on Brexit. We are 3 weeks from the end of the transition period, and it is a well-known fact that both Ireland and the Netherlands are two of the EU member states most exposed to the impact of Brexit, if not the most exposed. But beyond the immediate impact in terms of UK-Ireland or UK-EU relations, Brexit also raises questions about how the European Union is changing. And to make sense of this, I'm privileged to say this, I'm joined by two highly esteemed observers and commentators of UK, Irish, and European affairs, Fintan O'Toole and Caroline de Gruyter. Fintan O'Toole is a columnist with the Irish Times. He is the winner of both the prestigious Orwell Prize and the European Press Prize for his work on Brexit. You may well know him from his recent books, Heroic Failure, Brexit and the Politics of Pain, and 3 Years in Hell, The Brexit Chronicles. And secondly, joined by Caroline de Gruyter, she's the European Affairs correspondent and columnist for the Dutch daily, the NRC Handelsblad. She's a regular contributor to Carnegie Europe and Foreign Policy, and a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. She has been posted to Brussels twice, but also to Geneva, and currently lives in Oslo, which I think in the context of the Brexit negotiations offers a unique perspective. And with your permission, I would like to focus our discussion first on the immediate issues at hand, and then zoom out a little bit and look at the impact of Brexit on the EU. So starting off, yesterday, the UK and the EU, through Michael Gove and Maros Sefcovic, struck a deal on the outstanding issues in the Northern Ireland Protocol. Today, this morning, Simon Coveney, the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs, said that, quote, today is pivotal, alluding most likely to this evening's dinner between Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. I'd like to start off by asking Fintan, how important is this deal that was struck yesterday? And in comparison, how important do you think this evening's dinner is going to be?
So the deal that was struck on the Northern Ireland Protocol is undoubtedly very important. It's primarily important in and of itself, because it does provide a guarantee that whatever happens this evening or whatever happens between now and January the 1st, that there is some kind of operational structure in place to deal with this question, which of course has bedeviled the whole Brexit process, which is the Irish border. So, as people will remember, the solution to the Irish border question was to have Northern Ireland effectively remain within the customs union and the single market. And that then, of course, creates all sorts of problems. It's an unprecedented situation where you have a sovereign state effectively, allowing part of its own territory to be in a very, very different relationship to the European Union from the one it's adopting itself. And frankly, there were two big problems with that. One was that the British were simply doing nothing about it. Having signed up to it, there was very little sign of what practically on the ground has to be done to make this operable. But secondly, of course, as people will remember, then you had this extraordinary open declaration that Britain would not, in fact, abide by the withdrawal agreement in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. So, look, it's really welcome that in a way, the second of those, the crisis that Britain created by saying it was going to tear up international law, had a sort of paradoxical effect of eventually forcing them to actually get into proper discussions about it and pretty much sort it out. So that's very, very welcome, and it changes the mood. However, I think there are two important qualifications here. One is that I think it's motivated much more by looking across the Atlantic at a Joe Biden presidency than it is anything to do with its relationship to the European Union. There's a horrible realization dawning on the Tory government of Britain that it doesn't have Donald Trump there anymore. And Biden, has made it absolutely clear that there will be not even beginnings of a discussion about a UK-US trade deal so long as the Northern Ireland Protocol is not honored. So I think that's been the primary motive. And secondly, of course, the Irish government and the European Union are ad idem on this, on not wanting to be willing to say, you're absolutely wonderful, thank you so much for not breaking international law. You're really wonderful people, and we're going to reward you for your, pulling back from the brink of what would have been an absolutely outrageous thing to do. So yes, it helps, and it obviously removes what would have been a self-imposed obstacle. But I don't think it really changes the dynamic in relation to the substantive questions, which are the questions that are still there, which we all know. It sort of makes the conversation, or the continuation of the conversation, possible, but it doesn't make the resolution of those issues any easier.
Right, and so what you on Twitter, there's this heated debate taking place now whether tonight's dinner is going to be the crunch moment, whether it's going to resolve anything. And there are pessimists and there are optimists. What's the mood music in Dublin about tonight?
I think it's pretty pessimistic, to be honest. And this is interesting because Dublin has been optimistic all along, right? So, and this is partly wishful thinking in a way. If there's one government, I know this is certainly true of the Netherlands as well, but particularly in Ireland, that wants a deal, because we're the collateral damage so much in all of this, for political reasons in relation to Northern Ireland, but also for economic reasons, because our food and agricultural sector will be devastated by a no deal. So, there's an element of not wanting to actually contemplate no deal because it's so horrible. So Dublin has tended to maybe err on the optimistic side, and therefore it's interesting that the current mood is so pessimistic. And I have to say I somewhat share that pessimism. I don't think a deal is by any means impossible, but I think some of the stuff that you mentioned seeing on Twitter, particularly stuff that comes from the British side, there's a sort of myth somehow that Boris Johnson is incredibly charming, which personally I don't get, but this is believed in Britain, because a lot of English people particularly find him very charming. Scottish people don't, but in England, there's a sense that he's funny, he's charming, he's eccentric, and they love that. And some sort of, I almost childlike belief that just, Boris will charm Ursula von der Leyen, and that's how things operate. It's silly. First of all, I don't think he's that charming anyway, but even if he were, it's a ridiculous idea of what's at stake here. But the other question, and this is actually about Johnson's personality, is, look, we all know where this comes down to. It comes down to whether or not Johnson is willing to take personal responsibility for signing off on a deal that will not give Britain what he claimed it would, which is unfettered sovereignty. Fisheries is important, but the real question here comes back to this thing about sovereignty. And it comes back to dynamic alignment, the level playing field, not just as a sort of status quo, but as something that will change over time as standards change in the European Union. that's the stuff that Johnson has hyped up, into vassalage, this word that re-emerged from the medieval lexicon, with Brexit. That's an intolerable state. That's what Johnson, remember, resigned as foreign secretary, Theresa May's foreign secretary, over in relation to the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration previously. That has been his line. And the question is, does he have the political skill and the personal courage to cross that line? And I have to say that if you studied him, and I've had to for some sins in my previous life, there's nothing much about his personal or political career that makes you think this is a guy who's actually going to take that responsibility. So I'm anxious and on the pessimistic side, I think.
Yeah, thanks. And we'll return to that sovereignty issue a little bit later on, but I want to bring in Caroline. Caroline, I don't know whether I should see you as the token Dutch woman on the panel to describe the Dutch perspective, or as you're living in Norway now, whether you want to share some insights from how Norway looks at this UK-EU tussle. I mean, it also has its own relationship with the EU, which is oftentimes, of course, thrown into the Brexit debate. But first, I'd like to ask you, I mean, do you share Fintan's pessimism to some degree about tonight, or about the possibility of reaching an agreement by the end of the year?
Yes, I don't have a crystal ball either. And I indeed also think that it could go either way. I think it's not a very good sign for the state of the British democracy that it comes to one man, whether he has the guts or not to defend, let's call it reality. And let's go to the sovereignty issue immediately. Because what he has to accept or not is that in this world where everybody is interconnected with everybody, and that connectedness is used as a weapon often too, you cannot have total sovereignty. And this is something that many people in the United Kingdom and elsewhere in the world too are by now rather aware of. But the point is, I mean, he's staked his whole all his slogans on total sovereignty. So I really don't know what he's going to do. But I think if we don't get a deal tonight, we'll get one next week, or we'll get one in February. Then it will be harder and harder. But in the end, we will have to work together in some way again. And maybe some people are saying that maybe we need some serious disruption for that maybe not very dreamlike reality to sink in.
Yeah. Well, let's then tackle that issue of sovereignty in a little bit more detail. Fintan, in your recent writing, you've developed yourself into a bit of an analyst of the British psyche, and it's fascinating to, first of all, observe that the ultimate decision, deal, no deal, comes down to one person, as Caroline has said, but this fits within a broader trend in some streams of thinking in the UK regarding the role of the United Kingdom in the world, also the nostalgia of wanting to go back to a certain period in time by taking back control. Where do you see this purist interpretation of sovereignty coming from? I mean, what are its roots, and what does this tell us about what we can expect, looking ahead into the near future?
So I think there are three important factors here. One is the sort of the constitution of the British state. It's something we just have to bear in mind. It doesn't have a written constitution. It's a very strange kind of beast, and it's a sort of beta version of democracy. Britain in the 18th century was one of the most progressive, relatively democratic countries in the world in many ways. But it got stuck there, because it developed early. It got stuck with a very early kind of version of democracy, and in particular, a sort of obsession with the idea of the sovereign. The idea that sovereignty is a single thing and is embodied in a sovereign. And so, the British power lies, constitutionally, in the monarch in Parliament, this sort of weird idea, and you can't entirely get rid of this, like the role of monarchy and this of an idea that sovereignty is embodied in a single person. And this may seem ludicrous given that the monarchy doesn't really have any, direct political power at all. But that mentality of what sovereignty is a factor. The second big factor, of course, is, and you mentioned this, but it's not so much nostalgia for empire, but I've tried to argue that it's a sort of weird legacy of empire. Right? So an imperial worldview is binary. There are only two states in empire. You're either the imperial power or you are a subject. That's it. That's the way it works. And particularly for Britain, it was a very long, incredibly successful period as the top dog. What happens is not so much a sort of direct nostalgia for those days, but a legacy of this mentality, this binary mentality, which is, hold on a minute, we're not on top in the European Union. We're obviously not dominating it. So there's only one other possibility, which is that it's dominating us. Mm-hmm. So the idea of shared sovereignty, the idea that actually it's just quite normal, to use your sovereignty. Sovereignty is like a currency. There's no point in hoarding it all in a bank vault somewhere. It's useless to you if you don't buy something with it and spend it and circulate it. That idea has never entirely been accepted by much of the British ruling and media class. There's still a sense that going back means going back to a notion of dominance, and everybody on the outside looks and says, this is kind of ridiculous, you folks. You just, this doesn't make any sense. But you can't dismiss it because you find, Michael Gove, for example, famously saying, in the run-up to the referendum, on the day we vote to leave, we hold all the cards. We set the terms of trade. Yeah, they actually use that for we will set the terms of trade.
I remember.
And this is why we're stuck where we are now, because they've never got over that idea that it's something natural about Britain setting the terms of trade. And again, you may think, come on, that's just election referendum speak. It's ridiculous. This week on Monday, James Cleverly, who's minister in the Foreign Office, repeated almost exact for we still hold all the cards. So it's this binary mentality that just will not allow for the complexity of real sovereignty in the world. And of course the last thing is you can't ever get over the bogus nature of the proposition, right? So the Brexit proposition itself, there was nothing ignoble about Brexit. There's not, the idea of it, if you want to leave the European Union, it's perfectly fine. What's bogus is the suggestion that was at its heart, which was that you could leave and still have all the benefits. So that it wasn't really a choice to be made by the British people to say, well, look, you can have your unilateral sovereignty, but it's going to cost you. What was stated was you can have your unilateral sovereignty and there is no cost. There's no price to be paid for it. And that's the big lie. And again, that's never really been fully confronted. Which is to say, actually, what we told you about that was, I'm sorry, it was a mistake, or it just doesn't work like that. There is a price, and we have to decide, is the price worth paying or not? And that's why we're in this extraordinary situation that you're talking about a dinner to resolve something as enormous as the history of the next century for Britain, comes down to, does the penny finally drop that there's a price to be paid? That there's a trade-off between your sovereignty and your economic health, and are you or are you not willing to pay that price? And it would not surprise me if Boris Johnson on the plane going over is still thinking to himself, what do I think about that? Because they just haven't confronted it.
I see Caroline exactly. I mean, absolutely, Caroline, chip in. Also, I'm curious how the Norwegians and the Swiss have struggled. They must struggle with something similar.
Well, but this is what I was about to say. Indeed, I think they recognize this struggle. because they both don't want, I mean, actually the amount of people who want to join the EU, both in Switzerland and in Norway, is relatively low. It's below 20%. They think they're fine outside, but they're small. They know what they're worth, and they know that the EU is much bigger and that they cannot survive without almost full access to the internal market. So they have to compromise, and they carved out a few zones in which they can be fully sovereign. For instance, in Norway, it's energy and it's food. And so they make French cheeses ridiculously expensive here just in order to protect their own farmers. And they say their farmers are the best, and who make cheeses for a very small market. So those cheeses are also extremely expensive. When you see this happening as an outsider, I mean, it makes you smile a bit. You know, it's sweet and it's nice. It doesn't make any sense economically speaking. And the same is going on in Switzerland. So it's a bargain. And a lot of the Brexiteers, even before the referendum was organized in 2016, they came, of course, to Bern, and they went to Oslo as well. Like, how is it? But so they recognize the dilemma, but they have a totally different solution, because they realize that they're small and that they cannot change the EU. And I think the British, they have an issue with power, and they have trouble recognizing that the EU is bigger and more powerful.
Yeah. I'm just curious whether that also translate into different type of thinking inside the EU. Does the EU also, I mean, the EU traditionally sees itself as sort of the good guy in the story, right? That it's that it hasn't done anything wrong in that context to awaken the sovereignty dragon, if you will, in the UK. Is that something you share, or do you think that there's primarily blame on the UK side?
I wouldn't want to talk about blame one side or the other. I think the EU, I mean, in a way, this whole Brexit story is also a nice mirror for us in the EU. You know, all of a sudden we discover what is Euratom, because the British are discussing this, and we all read the British press. Or what is Galileo and why is it good for us? Or maybe not, I don't know. So they make us look in the mirror. But the problem is that the EU is a rules-based animal. And if you allow outsiders to flout the rules, then insiders will want to go out as well, because it will be better there. So on many of these rules-based issues, market issues, the EU cannot compromise. And I'm sure she wants to compromise, but it's just impossible. I think there are other issues like defense and foreign policy that's not rules-based that Europeans can easily compromise on. But that will follow next. But what strikes me is that this deal that we're talking about is so incredibly small. I mean, it's 3 times nothing. And you know, how many fishing boats do the Dutch or the French or the Belgians have in North Sea waters? I mean, a few hundred, that's about it. And that's what a lot of the talks are about, and what the energy goes in.
Yeah. The economic exposure of fishery to the overall EU economy is quite small, but It's of course politically quite sensitive a topic. I mean, personally, I would much rather have, even though it's a thin deal, I'd much rather have a deal rather than no deal, simply because it creates an element of confidence on the basis of which other types of agreements can be built. But it's interesting, the focus on smallness, if you will, as the determining factor in the Brexit negotiations. Fintan, just curious about the UK-Ireland relationship in the broader context of UK-EU relations. What we've seen after the discussion over the backstop, which became the front stop, We've had the internal market bill. We've had the specter of a taxation bill, which would also bring back the Northern Irish question again. Some of that now seems to have been resolved, hopefully. It does give a special place to Ireland in the Brexit negotiations. Also, drawing on what Caroline has said, Ireland is one of the how would you call them, less large member states in the EU. Why do you think Ireland has been such a, or has had such an outsized effect on the UK's view of its new relationship with the EU? Is it simply down to the territorial border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, or is there something else behind it that's made Ireland so prominent over the past 4 years as this prism through which we've been looking at Brexit?
So if we go back to the day after the Brexit referendum or whatever, I was very, very worried, because I thought Ireland's going to just get crushed in all of this, because it's small and there are bigger interests at stake, and there'll be lots of nice words from Germany and France, and they'll say how much they love Ireland, but when it comes down to it, Irish interests will not be central. And I think, and I'm biased as I'm looking at it from an Irish perspective, I think it's been an incredibly important moment for the European Union. I think it is the first time in its history that the European Union has really set the interests of a small member state at the center of its polity, And I think it almost surprised the European Union itself that it found itself doing this. I mean, it's worth saying, that the Irish diplomacy was extraordinarily skillful in doing this. So we now know, although we didn't really know at the time, that Irish diplomats were working on this in 2015. Were cornering their German counterparts or French, saying, look, if Brexit happens, this is, and so there's a simple story of diplomatic competence at work here. But I think also, and it goes back to your earlier questions, Caroline, that yes, the European Union is guilty, and it's guilty in relation to Ireland and in relation to a lot of its other smaller member states. I mean, Netherlands wouldn't really be one of them, but the way the European Central Bank dealt with the austerity crisis, the banking crisis, and crucified small nations, including Ireland, I think that was part of the backdrop, that there was some kind of sense that, maybe we didn't do that right. It's now completely accepted that the early ECB response to that under Trichet was disastrous. Ireland probably suffered more than any other country proportionally from that disaster. So there's an element of guilt there, but I think also the Irish question allowed the European Union to be the good guys. So the Irish question lifted the European stance above simple pragmatic, trade issues, and said, actually, it reminds the European Union that the European Union is a peace project. So when you find, Heiko Maas, for example, the German foreign minister, saying, the Irish peace process is a matter of identity for Germany. It's not an Irish issue. It's about how we understand the European Union and our relationship to the European Union and why the European Union exists. It reminds us all of that. Yeah. And so some of this you could say was cynical in that it allows you to be the good guy, put on the white hat. But I think sometimes in human affairs, something that may start out a little bit cynically can actually become something that people begin to really believe. And I think it's been, frankly, very good for the European Union to say, once we start saying that the Irish issue is absolutely central, then we can work backwards from that. And it sort of forces us to think about what are the values that are at stake here. The other, and even weirder thing is that, of course, Ireland is also in some way central to Brexiter thinking. In sort of, well, there were two sort of different Brexiteer obsessions with Ireland. One was, of course, the Irish would just leave when Britain left. And the outrage that Ireland said, well, actually, we're a sovereign nation, but you're talking about sovereignty. Well, actually, we've got a bit of that too. We may have joined the same time as you, but it doesn't mean we're going to leave just because you're leaving. And it was a bit of a shock, actually, to some of the Brexiteers. Who was, oh God, these people are not behaving themselves the way they ought to, and maybe things are not going to go the way we think they will. But also, this is where it gets really strange. I mean, Nigel Farage, on the door of his office in the European Parliament building, which I presume he never opened anyway, but on the occasions he did, at some point he managed to stick up on the outside of the door, where there's usually a photograph of the member of the Parliament, is a photograph of Charles Stewart Parnell, the Irish nationalist leader from the 19th century. A lot of the Brexiteers are obsessed with and this is where, you know, it's psychedelic stuff, really, it's LSD, you know, but that Britain now, in relation to the European Union, is like Ireland was in relation to Britain 100 years ago. That it's a colonized poor little country which is now having its independence struggle and its independence moment, you know, and this is completely insane. But it's part of this kind of weird obsession, and therefore also becomes sort of part of the bitterness, this feeling that, but we're Ireland now, and you people are selling us out. Like, why aren't you, you know, on our side about this? Because we're the little nation now who's taking on the colonial master, you know, and we're kind of saying, well, we sort of know what it's like to be a little nation with a colonial master, and it doesn't look like being in the EU, you know. And so you have this obviously complete disjunction of psychologies.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I want to give Caroline the chance to respond also from the perspective of how Brexit may have changed the EU, in the sense of how the EU thinks about itself, and also perhaps in relation to smaller countries like Ireland. But not before I remind our participants who are joining through Zoom that they can ask questions in the Q&A function, which you will see on the bottom of your screen. But Caroline, over to you.
Yeah, I think Brexit does a lot of things actually to the EU. First of all, it changes the whole political ball game. For instance, the Netherlands often hid behind fairly big back of the UK when it wanted to get things done in Brussels. When you had the UK on your side, you needed just a few small countries, and then you could make your point in Brussels. And these small countries like the Netherlands cannot play this game any longer. So France and Germany are relatively heavier since Brexit. And what you see now is that all kinds of small countries are trying to form coalitions. There are lots of coalitions in Europe. So this is the first effect, which actually takes the eyes of many Europeans, even the most pro-Anglo-Saxon countries like the Netherlands, off Brexit to the future of Europe. You know, it always surprises me in the past years how little we all have talked, we EU people, how little we have talked about Brexit. We talked about it before more than after the referendum. But I also think there's something else very interesting going on, is that because we slowly start to recognize the power of Europe and how we are not maybe only a force for the good, but we can also do harm. And what you see, you know, in a way, it's the EU is a little bit like an empire. And we try not to say that we are more powerful than the UK, or we are more powerful than Norway or Switzerland. But in effect, this is how it is. If you see the deal that was cut yesterday about Europeans and their right to inspect all kinds of sites in Northern Ireland, they are not allowed to fly the flag. They're not allowed to do this, and they're not allowed to. So it can't be seen. But of course, they have the right to do all these inspections. You know. So the UK gets the symbols of sovereignty, but the real sovereignty lies here with the EU, who enforces her rules on the territory. And it's interesting because empire was always a very negative word in Europe. You know, it was colonial, it was excessive, it was annexation, and so on. And slowly, we become more aware of the power that we have, not only because of Brexit, but also with the refugee crisis on the other side of Europe. And sometimes we have to, out of self to defend our interests, or even to out of self-preservation in the case of the internal market. We just have to put our foot down. And we hurt others. We hurt refugees. We also hurt people in Northern Ireland, because what if we don't get a deal in the end? In the end, the EU will force Ireland to put a border there. If the UK is not playing along, so it can get pretty nasty. But I think we're slowly discovering that we're in this kind of game.
That's picking up on that last point, Fintan, in Dublin. It seems from a deal versus no deal perspective, Ireland really is stuck a little bit between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that it wants a deal, but not at all costs, because for the reasons we've already discussed, level playing field, access to waters, it depends on how the Northern Ireland Protocol is implemented. And at the same time, a no deal does raise this question of the EU solidarity of the 26, which is now very strong vis-a-vis Ireland, could start to be put under pressure because of what Carolina said. This, in a no deal situation, there would be pressure on Dublin about sealing the border in the north. Is that, how do you see that factor in today's political debate in Dublin?
Yeah, I think Carolina has put this extremely well, which is the reminder of the power, and the need to be on the right side of that power, which is what Irish governments of different hues have grasped very quickly, which is, and this raises interesting questions for Ireland, of course, because just as Caroline said that the Netherlands is hidden behind Britain, well, Ireland's been very good at hiding behind Britain too, on all sorts of issues, right? So the border issue, well, the worst case scenario is that Britain goes totally rogue and tears up the withdrawal agreement, and tears up even the agreements which has been made yesterday. Right? I don't think it's going to do that. And I think certainly in the short term, it's not going to do it because Joe Biden will come down like a ton of bricks. I mean, Ireland has other friends, and the Americans are a very important factor in this, I think. So I wouldn't be particularly worried about the likelihood of the imposition of a hard border on the island of Ireland again. I think Britain will work the protocol, even if there's no deal, because remember, this is part of the withdrawal agreement. It's not part of a trade deal, so it's stuck with it. However, I think the really interesting issues for Ireland are going to be about taxation. And of course, this is also, Ireland and the Netherlands are, in the naughty corner about a lot of this stuff, and about the role of multinational corporations and how they're taxed, about digital taxation. We both of our countries have said, well, we're small countries, we need to, have our very specific tax policies, and we need to benefit from them. Sometimes with some justice, and sometimes just to suit ourselves, and at the expense of our fellow Europeans. And the big question is, the Brits have been a big block on allowing the European Union to develop more powers in the field of taxation. And certainly Ireland's been very, very glad to be able to hide behind them. So countries like the Netherlands and Ireland get much more exposed, and I'm not sure we have great answers to a lot of this stuff. I mean, the process has so far been outside of the structures of the European Union in terms of reforming global taxation, corporate taxation, but it's going to be a huge issue for the European Union. And it's not going to wait, because the pandemic, the need for radical new revenue raising measures, all that stuff is going to bring digital corporation taxes really right up to the front. And Ireland can't just say, actually, thanks very much for all your help in relation to the border, but you can take a running jump at yourself if you think we're going to ask Facebook and Apple and Twitter and all those lovely companies that we have in Dublin that we're going to come down on them in terms of digital taxation. So the dynamic of this will be very rapid and will involve tension. And so the idea of the Irish being good Europeans, we've been the golden boy for the last 4 or 5 years. I think that's going to wear off pretty rapidly too. But I don't think this is an unhealthy process. You know, these are real questions which need to be actually addressed at a European level. And I think Ireland and the Netherlands are just going to have to learn how to deal with them as honestly as we can.
It is definitely true that both Ireland and the Netherlands are a little bit in the naughty corner when it comes to taxation policy. It raises another question, and I'm going to use that as a segue to one of the questions that's been posed from the participants, and that is, after Brexit, the economic and demographic center of gravity inside the European Union has moved eastwards and southwards, basically away from Ireland and the Netherlands. If you look at the map, the Netherlands is now on the exposed western periphery of the European Union. The North Sea is an external border, and then a short hop across a small landmass called Great Britain, there is Ireland, this exclave of the EU. How does that feel? How does that make folks in the Netherlands and in Ireland feel in terms of the political impact that has? And I'd like to get both your views, and I'll ask Caroline first, also because Laurens Jan Brinkhorst, a former minister in the Netherlands dealing with European affairs, but also with agricultural affairs, asks whether, you know, the Netherlands has never liked the EU to become more political, unlike Ireland and Belgium, he says. But do you think that Brexit will change that view? And he says there's now actually talk about possible opt-outs in the Netherlands for new EU initiatives. I mean, could you take those two issues together? On the one hand, to what extent the Dutch feel exposed on this northwestern periphery? And the other point from Laurens Jan Brinkhorst about, okay, is there acceptance in the Netherlands about new steps towards political integration, or does the Netherlands see itself as being on the balance board when it comes to deciding to continue or not?
I think the border, since all the enlargements in the early 2000s, the heart of Europe has shifted southeastwards already. I think the heart of Europe is somewhere between Munich and Vienna at the moment. This is something, frankly, that the UK and the Netherlands have strongly pushed because they wanted a bigger market. And a bigger market with more countries is good for business, but it's also very good against a more political Europe, because so many countries will never be able to agree on anything, right? So it would water down the political Europe. And what they've gotten is that the British have drifted away further from the continent, and that the Netherlands is still there. I think we always have felt somewhat ambivalent about, you know, one leg. We're very transatlantic at heart in the Netherlands, Atlantic and transatlantic. But the reality is we are on the continent, and we're a province of Germany. So we have learned from day one to marry the one with the other. So I think there's always been a reluctance in the Netherlands to accept a more political Europe. That's also nothing new, and I think this is not going to change. Sorry. I have to see, because on the one hand, you also see that the Dutch have given up their resistance against, for instance, European defense. They used to be very much against it, but since Brexit, they've given up their resistance. So Brexit has also melted some of their traditional resistances. I think it very much depends where Europe is going. Before you can really answer the question, how much of that political Europe do they accept to have in the end? And it also depends not only on us, it depends on Putin, on Erdogan, on what the Americans do. we're out there in a world that is more mercantile than ever. So sometimes you have to take positions, even if you don't like it. And I think the Dutch are very pragmatic in that sense.
Thanks. And
sorry to be long, but it was two questions.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not complaining. Fintan, from the view of Dublin, I mean, is my characterization of that exposure, is that an apt one? I mean, how does Ireland now feel in terms of its EU membership?
I was fascinated by what Caroline was saying so eloquently about the Netherlands, because I think the difference with Ireland is that we're very used to feeling marginalized. Right? So, and the question for us is not, we're never going to be not marginalized. Geography is destiny, is where we are. And you're right about, when you look at the map, you think, oh God, we're becoming even more marginal. But in a funny way, Brexit sort of plays into a question which has been there for Ireland really since independence, or maybe even before independence, right? Which is a question of, we're going to be marginal, but what are we an island of? Are we an island of Britain, or are we an island of Europe? And Brexit sort of answers that question. Well, you're an island. Of course, you're both, but the primary direction now of Ireland is to be an island of Europe. And indeed,
I mean, this is your emancipation from the UK, in a way. Like Portugal was emancipated when they got the first president of the European Commission. They emancipated from Spain.
Of course, this is what Britain can never understand, that for small countries, sovereignty and independence are absolutely about being in the European Union. That's what's vindicated and made sense of our sovereignty. But of course, being an island of Europe is also being an island facing America. So, and again, I was very interested in what you were saying, Caroline, about the Atlanticist thing in Holland. But of course, it's, if anything, even stronger in Ireland. Oddly enough, not politically. So Ireland's never been in NATO, for example. But Ireland has these very, very strong historic and cultural links, religious links, even to the United States, which are kind of enhanced with a Biden presidency, for example. So I think Ireland, in a way, psychologically feels quite comfortable being somewhere between the United States and continental Europe. The real problem for Ireland actually is not that. The real problem for Ireland is, how do we remake the relationship with Britain? Because it's very easy to then start deluding yourself and saying, we're just a European country, isn't it great? Well, you're not actually. You're still, because of Northern Ireland, we share an island with part of the UK, but also we have so many very profound historic, social, cultural, economic links to the UK, which will continue. They're not going to go away. So actually, the hard part for us is actually thinking about our Europeanness. And of course, it's not something we have time to discuss now, but this is dynamic. This is not going away either as an issue, but also in terms of the very shape of the UK is now up for grabs. Particularly if there's if there's a no-deal Brexit, I think it increases the chances of Scottish independence very greatly. And remember, the Scottish elections are going to be in May next year. If those elections are being held with the SNP looking for a mandate for a second referendum in the context of a no-deal chaos, plus the pandemic chaos, plus all of that, and this has very profound implications for Ireland too. So actually our British relationship at the moment is likely to be more problematic than our American or European ones.
Yeah, and I'm just going to sort of contradict the question I just posed, that at least from my vantage point, I think you're absolutely right, Fintan, that Irish diplomacy has proved itself extraordinarily capable over the past and effective over the past couple of years, and also with Joe Biden now in the White House. And I'm always amazed by the anecdote that when he was vice president, the U.S. Secret Service had as a name for him Celtic. That was his name, his call sign. And he profoundly believes in strong Irish-American relations. And so the bridge function that the UK traditionally played in terms of linking transatlantic partners together, linking the US to the EU debate and vice versa, can now, to some degree, be fulfilled also by the Irish. And if you connect that also with current functions that Irish men and women hold inside the EU institutions, I can make a very strong argument that the Irish star has really risen inside the EU. I have a question from Kees van Rij, who asks, what do the panelists, and it's sort of along the same line of reasoning we've been following, but what do the panelists expect from stronger French-German cooperation, or the Franco-German engine after Brexit? I don't know, Caroline, do you want to go first?
Yeah, as I said, since a big country, just in terms of weight, a big country has left the European Union, it makes the other big countries a little bit relatively larger, of course. So I think this motor, the axis, Paris, Berlin, is becoming more important. But then it has always been important because the EU is a peace project that started with France and Germany. Basically, put them all in a harness of rules with as many other countries around them as possible. And this is a way to contain Germany. I mean, that's what it is. It's what it's always been. And France and Germany never agree on anything. So when they find a compromise, usually many other countries with a lot of pushing and pulling will follow. And this is how it works. And this will be how it will work. And I think Brexit only re-emphasizes this. There's nothing new about it.
Moving on, I have a question from Michel Malroy, who asks, and this is for you, Fintan, do you think that a no-deal Brexit could lead more quickly to a reunification process on the island? So in Ireland?
Yes, I do. And I don't think that the speed of this is a good thing. Right? So you have to remember that a big part of the Irish argument in relation to the border and the backstop and all that was about saying, look, this is still very fragile. You know, it may be 20 years since the Belfast Agreement, but you know, it's a very fragile society. It's still, Northern Ireland particularly, it's very divided. There are still bad actors, you know, who are looking to restart conflict at any possible opportunity. Scottish independence, if it happens, I think is the big catalyst here. You know, so you have a long-term sort of demographic shift, right? So probably the next census in Northern Ireland will show a Catholic majority. That doesn't translate simply into people wanting United Ireland. I think there's sometimes people oversimplify the sectarian geography of it, you know, but of course it has profound consequences. If the UK itself breaks up, which it would with Scottish independence, then the real problem is what do you do with 1 million Unionists, Protestants in Northern Ireland, whose identity they say is British. Mm-hmm. And not just they say, but remember, part of the peace agreement was that the Irish constitution was changed to recognize and to support in perpetuity the right of those people to be British, to actually have a British identity. It doesn't necessarily mean that it takes a particular political form. My fear is that in a way, if there's continuing chaos in the UK, if it leads to Scottish independence, if the UK as an entity breaks up, you're sort of left with the old problem again, you know, which is that there isn't agreement, and you have a terrain which is not yet really politically shared, and how you manage that, I think, was always going to be very difficult. I think most people in Southern Ireland, like myself, would have thought, okay, this is a 10, 15, maybe 20-year process that needs to be done very delicately, with great respect, with reconciliation, with all of those kind of things first, and complex political arrangements, not a simple, you know, monolithic United Ireland. It could be that we'd be forced to actually try and deal with these things in a matter of 5 years, and I don't welcome that prospect, quite honestly. I think it's one that we're not ready for. The economics of it have not been prepared, but also the psychology of it has not been prepared. It cannot just be the existing Irish state absorbing a lot of people who don't want to be in it. You know, yeah. That's a disaster. Yeah. I think there are other ways of doing this, but I think they need to be done, you know, with a lot more care and attention, and ideally not under the kind of pressure that Brexit is creating.
And just to remind our viewers, institutionally, how a border poll is foreseen in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, but there are certain institutional criteria that have to be met, correct? I mean, it wouldn't be simply, one side of the argument wants a poll and then it happens. It's a collective decision.
Well, it's not even a collective. It's a very weird, and I think was probably something that was done in a bit of a rush with that agreement. So it's the Northern Ireland Secretary, so the British Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, gets to decide whether or not to call a poll. And the agreement doesn't really lay down any very clear criteria as to how she or he should make that decision. The assumption is if you had opinion polls maybe showing that there was a significant majority in favor of change, then that would be called. But the process itself is very unclear. And secondly, what's often left out in relation to this is that it's not one referendum. Of course, it's two referendums because there had to be a referendum south of the border. There's an assumption that this would pass in the south. Well, it would depend very much as well on answers to economic questions and you know, to what the circumstances and the way in which it was framed. So it's a messy business actually, and to me, the energy still has to go into, I mean, absolutely this needs to be discussed. So it really needs a lot of open discussion about this because we may be forced to deal with it whether we like to or not. So we should be preparing. But I think the energy has to go into this idea that's in the Irish Constitution, the lovely wording that we put into it actually, which was we dropped the territorial claim over Northern Ireland and replaced it with the idea of the Irish nation being, you know, wanting to see the sharing of the island by all the people who share the island in all the diversity of their identities and traditions. It's a wonderful phrasing, but actually what that translates into politically is not an easy question to answer.
Interesting. That's one to watch. With an eye on the clock, rather. I have one more question from the audience, and then I have one final question for you. And then, unfortunately, we're going to be out of time. So this is a question for Caroline from Tom de Bruin, who is chairman of the supervisory board of the Clingendael Institute. And he asks, in recent research by the University of Amsterdam, 40% of respondents indicated that the Netherlands has lost influence in the EU, probably due to Brexit. But if that sentiment persists, and mind you, we are approaching elections in March, where I think Europe is going to be one of the main themes, what will that support for the EU continue to erode?
I'm not so sure. It could, but then you never know. But the same result I've seen in another poll done by the European Council on Foreign Relations a couple of weeks ago. The perception, but there it shows it's not just the Netherlands. This was a poll done among all the so-called frugal countries. And they all have the feeling, except the Finns to a certain extent, that they have lost power in recent years. So the perception seems to be across the board. I saw a poll in France where people also had the feeling that they lost power. So it's not just a Dutch thing. And I think, again, that many of the Dutch are very pragmatic people, and they also see their own government, because that would be my second point. They see their own government trying to carve out a somewhat bigger role for itself. Remember, during the budget negotiations and now the debates and the fights on the rule of law, the Dutch have played, well, a role that, according to another piece of research also from ECFR, a role that is seen by most of the other countries as far too large for its shoes. You know, the Netherlands was the number one country among all the EU member states, perceived as punching below, how do you say that? As punching
above its weight?
Above its weight, yes, thank you. So yeah, it's a bit,
A battle of the poles.
Not very clear what this actually all points to. So.
I unfortunately have to bring our conversation, our fireside chat, to an end, but not before I bring it back to the acute issue of the day. And I'm going to put you horribly on the spot and ask you, deal or no deal, where are we going to be 3 weeks from now?
You go first.
Yeah, exactly. Fintan.
my gut feeling is probably not a deal now. Talks will break up and reconvene, but I cannot see right now a deal that's going to be fully operable on January 1st. And I think that's, from a British point of view, that's crazy, because it means that they will be re-engaging with negotiations from a position of obvious chaos. I really hope that doesn't happen. I really hope that Johnson shows a bit of real leadership, but those who have trusted Boris Johnson in the past at all sorts of levels have lived to regret it. So I'm not going to be one of them right now.
Thank you. Caroline?
Well, I really don't know, but I would not be surprised if there would be a deal. Maybe not tonight, but the next week. And it's also part of the strategy, I think, to see how far they can stretch solidarity in the EU. And I would not be surprised if there would be a deal in the end, however small.
So we have a good glass half empty and a good glass half full. Thank you very much to both of you for spending this hour with me. I thought it was really interesting, fascinating to hear your insights and to learn a little bit more about how the Irish, the Dutch, but also the Norwegians and the Swiss view what's happening in the UK. I am not going to formally close this session. I'm going to give the floor to the Irish ambassador to the Netherlands, Kevin Kelly. Ambassador Kelly, good to see you, and thank you very much for offering the spark that brought us all here together. So over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Rem. And I know our own Taoiseach talked about 50-50, so I was really listening to see what Caroline would say in terms of the prospects. But listen, thank you very much, all of you, for this fireside chat on a very wintry day, at least here in The Hague, and I'm sure it's bound to be the same back in Ireland. Today was designed very much as a platform to hear, not designed to listen to governmental perspectives. So, and as you know, Rem, there's been many opportunities over the past few years to listen to government views coming from me here in The Hague. So I won't comment or react to the many interesting points made today, even to the nice comments made about Irish diplomacy, but I'll bask in them quietly. But I'll just instead just take the opportunity to thank the excellent speakers today. Fintan and Caroline, I've been plotting for quite some time to get the both of you together. So you never disappoint in terms of the clarity of your thoughts and the power of your words. And I believe that this event has offered a very valuable insight into the messy and complex business of Brexit. I also want to especially thank Rem for your expert handling of the discussion, and that your handling of it was very much informed by, I know, your own reflections and extensive writings and topics, and taking the time to visit Ireland and understand better. So thanks to you and to the colleagues in Clingendael and the embassy for making the event possible. I'll just be very brief, a few words, and just to say that, of course, we've all tracked the tortured process of Brexit blow by blow over the last 4 years. And even if the promise of a deal is agreed over dessert tonight, as we hope it will be in Brussels, I know that there will be disruption, and that Ireland and the Netherlands will be two of the most affected countries, due, as has been said, to our geographical location and our market exposure to the UK. In 1973, as the UK prepared to join the European community, the commentator Andrew Shunfield dubbed it, he called it the journey to an unknown destination. And just a couple of years ago in 2017, The historian and politician Julie Smith called the UK's journey out of the EU as destination unknown. So I think while none of us know what the future will hold, we are, and I think we've heard it today, we're all keen to ensure a positive and a productive relationship with the UK. As we move to the future, we in Ireland are very conscious of the need to focus our energies on the future of the EU and the importance of strengthening the existing relationships within the Union. And just to say, as ambassador of the Netherlands since 2016, I have experienced firsthand growing connections between our two countries and the common political, economic and cultural outlook that we share. I mean, the visits to Dublin and The Hague, there's been a regular crisscrossing of politicians and Taoiseach and prime ministers between The Hague and Dublin. And of course, the state visit by their majesties to Ireland last year was hugely symbolic. And we very much appreciated the solidarity that we've seen from the Netherlands, especially from all the EU, remainder of 27, but particularly from the Netherlands. It's been remarkable. And we're seeing growing economic links between our countries. Since 2016, our exports have grown by 40%. So our economies are fueled by technology and innovation and foreign investment. But I suppose I want to conclude by saying that our bilateral connections are shaped by our culture and by our shared values. And as we both survey this likely post-Brexit landscape, we must now weigh up the potential for an even stronger alliance going forward between Ireland and the Netherlands. And I will really conclude here, but just with perhaps an anecdote. In searching for positives from Brexit, I'm actually reminded of a conversation that I witnessed between a former Dutch foreign minister who, while he was lamenting the imminent departure of the UK from the Union, he joked sadly to the Irish counterpart of the time that without this large landmass blocking the clear view between both of our countries, that the Netherlands and Ireland should be able to see each other more clearly. So while there's definitely very little upside to Brexit, and neither of us wished the UK to leave, perhaps if we're looking for silver linings, that's one positive that I would want to focus on. So today's event in bringing together Dutch and Irish citizens and in such large numbers online is, in my view, part of that continuing conversation. So I really wanted to thank you all for taking part in the event, and thank you, Rem, for very expertly steering us through.
Thank you very much. And with that, we close. So thank you very much for participating online. Have a very happy holidays or Christmas break. And as they say, stay healthy and stay safe. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks.